I was taught to love the smell of paper the way other children were taught to love the smell of bread. In the fortress, Habs where we were raised, the air was never clean, never fresh, never honest, but the archives had their own atmosphere, a sealed climate of ink and dust and sanctified preservatives. The vault doors hissed when they opened, exhaling cold air that tasted faintly of copper and bitter incense. Every shelf was numbered, every tome chained, every scroll wrapped in waxed cloth and stamped with approvals that mattered more than the words inside. When I was young, I thought that was reverence. Now I know it was fear, dressed up as order. They called us scholars before they called us soldiers. It was not a compliment, it was a category, a strength to be managed. Our dormitories were austere, stone bunks, folded blankets, the faint thrum of generators behind the walls, but our training halls were filled with lecterns and cogitator slates as much as sparring cages. We memorized litanies and logistics in the same breath. We learned the names of weapons and the names of sins, and we were told both were equally fatal when mishandled. There were overseers, always, men and women in grey robes with blank eyes and bruised hands, remembrancers with devotional pendants and data, skulls that hovered above their shoulders, recording our recitations, our errors, our improvements. They logged everything, how quickly we learned, what questions we asked, how long our gaze lingered on forbidden paragraphs before we turned away like obedient children. The act of learning was never private. The act of thinking was never unobserved. Even the silence was monitored. We marched in file between chapel and archive, between drill yard and scriptorium. We rose to bells, ate to bells, prayed to bells. The bells were the hive's heartbeat, and our lives were timed to it down to the breath. I remember the texture of the ration bread, dense, faintly sour, flecked with grit that ground between the teeth. I remember the taste of recycled water, metallic and slightly sweet, as if the pipes themselves were rotting. I remember the constant oil, smoke of the manufacturum vents drifting in from above, coating everything in a film that never fully washed away. And yet I remember the pride, too. When an instructor praised my memory, it felt like receiving a purity seal. When I was permitted to handle a bound volume without gloves, because my compliance record was satisfactory, I almost trembled. The books were heavy, their covers hard and worn smooth by centuries of careful hands. I ran my fingers over embossed seals and felt the raised ridges like scars. Each page turned with a soft rasp, like a whisper. Sometimes the paper was so old it felt like dried skin. Sometimes the ink was faded, but still legible, because the Imperium is very good at preserving what it fears to lose. The instructors warned us knowledge is a weapon. Knowledge is also a door. Doors open both ways. We nodded. We copied that line. We wrote it in the margins of our training manuals. We believed it the way children believe the sky is permanent. If there were doors, the Imperium surely held the keys. If there were dangers, the Imperium surely had procedures. Procedures were our catechism. There was a place in the archive called the Correction Alcove, where incorrect texts were stored pending review. It sat behind a brass grill and smelled of mold. The lecterns there were bolted down. The lamps were dimmer. We were told to avoid it unless instructed. Naturally, we were instructed often. Learn to identify errors, our overseer would say, and his data visor would blink with approval as we approached the alcove. The errors were small at first. A date that didn't match the official timeline. A name spelled differently in 2 copies of the same decree. A devotional verse missing a line. I remember my stomach tightening when I found them, because finding them felt like touching a live wire. Mistakes were not supposed to exist. Mistakes implied a crack in the machine. A crack implies weakness. Weakness is heresy. We filed error notices on standard forms and submitted them with obedient hands. The forms were stamped and filed. The books were returned to shelves. The instructors praised our diligence. But sometimes, rarely, we found errors that weren't errors. That were something else. I remember the first time I saw a marginal note that didn't match the scribe's hand. It was a thin, spidery script tucked into the corner of a holy text, written in ink darker than the rest, as if fresher. It should not have been there. The book's seals were unbroken. The chain was intact. The ledger showed no record of unauthorized access. The note was only 3 words. I will not write them. I will not even repeat them in my own mind if I can help it. They were not obscene, not blasphemous in the crude way street preachers warn about. They were simple, quietly wrong. They made my skin prickle. They made my heart beat faster. They made the air around me feel attentive. I told my overseer, because that is what one does. Because procedure demanded it. He did not look at the note. He only looked at me. His gaze lingered on my face a fraction too long, as if reading something in my expression that was not written there. Then he snapped the book shut and pressed his signet seal against the cover, hard enough to leave a new wax imprint atop the old. "Forget you saw this," he said, voice low. "Log it as ink bleed. Misprint, nothing more." I blinked, stunned. "But..." He leaned closer. I smelled the faint soreness of old breath behind his incense. "Do you want to remain in good standing?" he asked. The question was not rhetorical. Good standing meant food, warmth, access, survival. "Yes," I whispered. "Then forget." I went back to my bunk that night and lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant roar of manufacturum turbines through the stone. The note replayed in my mind against my will. Each time it surfaced, it brought the same prickling sensation, like the touch of a fingertip against the inside of my skull. I pressed my palms against my temples and recited prayers until my lips were numb. Sleep came anyway, heavy and sudden, as if dropped on me. That was my first vision. It was not like a dream. Dreams are soft around the edges, full of drifting nonsense. This was sharp, clean, oppressive. I stood in a corridor I had never seen, vast, arched, lined with statues whose faces were worn smooth. There were chains on the ceiling, swaying gently. A single light burned yellow overhead. The air smelled of dust and something sweetly rotten. I heard chanting, layered and overlapping, vibrating through my bones. Somewhere in that corridor, someone whispered my designation number, slow and deliberate, as if tasting it. When I woke, my pillow was damp with sweat. My heart hammered. My mouth tasted of iron. I reported the vision in the morning, because procedure demanded it. There was a form for anomalous dreams. There were stamps for it. I filled it out carefully, hand shaking. The overseer took it without comment and placed it in a tray marked pending review. That evening, the form was returned to me, not with corrections, with an additional stamp UNXSI, under it, in the overseer's neat hand, "Do not file again." My second vision came 2 nights later. My third came the night after that. Each one more vivid, more sensory, more invasive. Corridors that pressed too close. Bells that rang in my teeth. Shadows that moved like they were thinking. I woke with headache so severe I vomited bile into the communal basin, watched by other recruits who pretended not to see. My hands trembled when I tried to hold a stylus. My eyes burned as if filled with grit. The infirmary attendant recorded my symptoms and issued me a chalky suppressant tablet stamped with a purity mark. "Stress response," he said, avoiding my gaze, "common in high-performance cadres." He logged it, he filed it, he sent the report upward. Days later, a different attendant approached my bunk with a small slate and a request for follow-up. That request made my stomach twist. Requests for follow-up were rare. It meant attention. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant danger. He took my pulse. He shone a light into my eyes. He pressed fingers into my skull where the pain throbbed. Each touch felt too sharp, too present. I flinched. He made notes. Then, without looking up, he asked, "Do you still experience irregular visions?" I hesitated. In that hesitation, I felt the first true stir of fear, not fear of pain, not fear of discipline, but fear of being noticed by something that was not a human office. "Yes," I admitted. The attendant's stylus paused. "Report to archive oversight," he said softly, immediately after evening prayer. Archive oversight was not a room. It was a corridor of rooms, a small bureaucratic organ hidden behind layers of locks and devotional seals. Its air was colder than the archive itself. Its walls were lined with filing cabinets rather than shelves. The clerks there did not wear visors. They wore masks, smooth and expressionless, with tiny vents that hissed as they breathed. Their hands were stained with ink and something darker. They asked me questions in a monotone voice. When did the visions start? How many per week? What sensory details? Did I hear words? Did I see symbols? Did I feel compelled to act? Each answer was written down. Each answer was stamped. Each stamp sounded like a nail being driven into wood. At the end, one clerk slid a slate toward me. On it was my designation, my compliance record, my education index, and a new line freshly added, observation status elevated. I stared at it, throat tight. "What does that mean?" I asked, voice barely audible. The clerk did not answer the question. He recited a warning instead. "Curiosity is loyalty when sanctioned," he said. "Curiosity is corrosion when unsanctioned. Continue to comply." Then he dismissed me with a gesture as cold as a shutdown signal. That night, as I lay in my bunk listening to the bell, timed breathing of the dormitory, I understood something I had refused to see. Knowledge had always been the bait. The Imperium fed it to us in measured rations, praised us for swallowing, punished us for asking for more. And now something else had scented the same hunger in us, and it was leaning close, waiting for us to taste it. My head throbbed. My skin prickled. In the darkness my eyes refused to close. Somewhere beyond the walls, the hive's bells told the hour, and I knew, with the certainty of a stamped decree, that the Imperium was watching us now not with pride, but with suspicion, because we had learned too well. The curse did not arrive like a battlefield wound, clean and honest. It came like paperwork that never stops coming, quiet at first. A new form slid into the stack, a new checkbox that did not exist yesterday. It came as small failures that should have meant rest and quarantine, but instead meant additional observation and a return to duty. In the fortress, Hab's weakness is a discipline problem until it becomes a logistical problem, and even then it is handled with stamps, not sympathy. My hands were the first to betray me. During morning recitation, I held my slate the way I always had, left palm steady, right stylus precise, and the line I was copying wavered. Not because my mind failed, but because my fingers did. A tremor ran through my knuckles, subtle as a vibration through an old pipe. I corrected it, tightened my grip, forced my wrist still. The tremor returned anyway, a stubborn little rebellion in the joints. The overseer's data skull dipped and whirred, focusing on my hands. A moment later, a tiny chime sounded from his visor. He did not scold me. That would have been almost kind. He only said, "Note the deviation," as if speaking to the air, and the remembrancer beside him made a mark in a ledger. Later, in the drill yard, my rifle practice degraded by 0.5 percentage point. It was enough to be noticed, not enough to be forgiven. They pulled me from the line at the end of the session and walked me to the infirmary in silence. The corridors smelled of soap and machine oil. Lumen strips flickered overhead like failing faith. I kept my eyes forward, because looking around is how trouble begins. The infirmary was clean in the way only Imperial facilities are clean, sterilized surfaces covering old stains, incense masking the sour breath of too many bodies passing through. The walls were pale stone, damp to the touch. Steel benches were bolted to the floor in neat rows. A speaker in the corner droned out a looped prayer for bodily purity, the words softened by static until they felt less like devotion and more like instruction. The attendant there, an apothecary's subordinate, not yet augmented enough to be a servitor, but already moving with a kind of learned emptiness, took my vitals without looking at my face. His gloves were thin, his touch clinical, and yet my skin reacted to it sharply, prickling as if every nerve had been turned up. He pressed fingers against my wrist, and the sensation traveled too far up my arm, bright and insistent. He muttered. He ran an Auspex wand along my spine. The device chirped. He frowned not with concern, but with curiosity. "Anomalous neural activity," he said, as if reading a temperature. "Report this." "To whom?" I asked before I could stop myself. His eyes flicked up, expression briefly hard. "Not to me," he replied. Then he lowered his gaze again. "You will be flagged. Continue your duties." Flagged. The word landed in my stomach like cold metal. They gave me tablets, chalky, bitter, wrapped in wax paper stamped with purity seals, and told me to ingest them at prescribed intervals. I did. Of course I did. Compliance was the only thing I still believed in. The tablets dulled the headaches for an hour at most, turning the pain into a heavy pressure behind the eyes. But they did nothing for the tremor, and nothing for the dreams that were no longer dreams. The visions began bleeding into waking hours. During lectures, the instructor's voice would distort for a heartbeat, his words slipping into a rhythm that felt too much like chanting. The air would thicken with imaginary incense. Shadows would deepen in the corners of the room, and I would swear I saw chains hanging where there were none. Then the moment would pass, leaving me blinking at my slate, unsure whether I had lost seconds or simply lost certainty. I learned not to react. Reaction was evidence. It wasn't just my nerves. My body began failing in small, humiliating ways. Nosebleeds that came without warning, warm and sudden, forcing me to pinch my nostrils while pretending nothing was wrong. A metallic taste in my mouth during prayer. Bruises that appeared where no blow had landed. A constant ache in my joints, as if I were older than I had any right to be. I reported what procedure demanded I report. The reports vanished. That became a pattern. Forms filed, stamps applied, follow-ups requested, and then silence, as if the machine that governed us had decided my degradation was an acceptable margin of error. There were days I wondered if the oversight corridor had ever existed, if my elevated status had been a hallucination too. Then a clerk would appear with a new slate, requiring my signature acknowledging receipt of monitoring protocol adjustments. Adjustments. Always adjustments. Never answers. Then came the first misfire. It happened during a live fire exercise in a cavernous range beneath the fortress Habs. The range smelled of propellant, scorched metal, and sweat. Targets hung from rails in the darkness, sliding forward and back with mechanical indifference. We stood in a line, helmets on, rifles raised, and the instructor barked orders through a vox grill that made every syllable sound like a judgment. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked, as expected. The shot cracked through the chamber. The target sparked where the round struck. Then my chest tightened, not like fear, not like exertion, like my lungs had forgotten the pattern of breathing. For a terrifying second, no air moved in or out. My vision tunneled. The sound of the range dulled as if someone had stuffed cotton in my ears. I tried to inhale. My chest refused. Panic surged hot and violent. And then, without warning, it released. Air rushed in with a ragged gasp that sounded too loud in my helmet. I steadied myself, forcing the tremor in my hands down by sheer will. No one around me reacted. Either they didn't notice, or they pretended not to. In the Imperium, pretending is a survival skill. After the exercise, I went directly to the infirmary. The attendant ran the auspex again. This time it chirped more insistently. He called in an apothecary. The apothecary was taller, older, with a face like carved stone and the faint hum of augmetics beneath his robes. His hands were clean, his eyes sharp. When he pressed his fingers against my sternum, I felt the touch like a shock, not painful, but too intense, too present. He made a note, then another. His subordinate held a slate with my case file open, scrolling through my entries. Subject experiences episodic pulmonary arrest. The apothecary said calmly, as if dictating a shipment manifest. Neurological instability, hemorrhagic anomalies, persistent visions, elevated observation status. His eyes met mine briefly. In that glance I saw something I had not expected, not pity, but calculation. How long has this been ongoing? He asked. I hesitated, then told the truth. Weeks, I said. Maybe longer. He tapped the slate. And you continued training? Yes, I replied automatically. I complied. Good, he said, and the word chilled me. Endurance is measurable. He instructed his subordinate to log my condition under a new classification, anomalous degradation. Not curse, not but heresy. Degradation, as if my body were a machine whose parts were wearing out prematurely. None lethal? He added after a moment, almost thoughtfully. I stared at him. None lethal, I repeated, voice thin. How can you know that? He didn't answer directly. Because you are still here, he said. And because the data suggests an unusual persistence. Unusual persistence. Again, that cold professional fascination. They did not remove me from duty. They did not quarantine me. They did not grant me the mercy of rest. They issued additional tablets, increased monitoring, and scheduled me for weekly assessments. Then they stamped a clearance form and sent me back to training. Pain became constant after that, a low background hum in the bones. Sometimes it spiked. Sharp behind the eyes, tight in the chest, hot in the joints, but it never fully left. I learned to move with it, to speak through it, to pray with it. The curse, degradation, whatever it was, did not kill me quickly. It simply refused to let me be normal, and with each day, something else became clear. The pain wasn't the only thing increasing. My awareness sharpened in strange ways. Sounds carried farther. Scents were stronger, more layered: oil, incense, human breath. The faint soreness of fear. Textures felt vivid: the rough weave of my robes against skin, the cold bite of metal railings, the heat of a lumen strip's failing ballast. It was as if my body were breaking and compensating at the same time, turning suffering into clarity. That clarity was a curse all its own. The apothecaries grew more attentive. They asked for precise descriptions, timed my symptoms, charted my endurance. I watched reports being sealed in red wax and carried away by silent clerks. I heard rumors of sealed vaults where such reports were stored, rooms no recruit ever entered, where data went to become secrets. I began to understand that death had somehow passed us by, not out of mercy, but out of administrative indecision. The machine did not know how to dispose of what it could not categorize, so it observed, it documented, it waited, and in that waiting, my body kept going, failing, recovering, failing again. Like a condemned engine forced to run until it either explodes or becomes something else entirely. They did not tell us the deployment was meant to be our ending. Of course they wouldn't. The Imperium does not announce executions when they can be hidden inside casualty projections and supply requisitions. Instead, the order came down wrapped in the language of necessity: force redeployment, strategic pressure point, acceptable loss theater. The words were stamped, counter-stamped, sanctified, and distributed. We read them in briefing halls that smelled of oil and old sweat, standing at attention beneath banners too heavy with history to move. The sanctioned battlefield was a dead place long before we arrived. The sky above it was the color of old bruises, perpetually choked with ash clouds that drifted in slow, suffocating currents. The ground was a mosaic of rubble and fused glass, where cities had been burned down to their foundations and then burned again for emphasis. Every step crunched, not just with stone, but with the fine particulate remains of lives ground into dust and spread evenly by artillery. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it felt, not silent, never silent, but muted, as if the world itself were exhausted. Distant shelling rumbled like a sick stomach. The wind moaned through skeletal structures, carrying the smell of charred metal and something faintly organic. Vox traffic crackled constantly in my ear, layered with orders, corrections, prayers, and static. Even before the first shot was fired, my head throbbed in time with it all. We advanced through ruin, choked streets in disciplined formations, boots grinding ash into powder. My armor felt heavier than it should have, pressing against my joints where the ache never fully faded anymore. With every step, pain flared and receded, a rhythm I had learned to move with. Around me, my brothers marched in silence, faces hidden behind visors, designation numbers glowing faintly on armor plates. I remember noticing how many of us were limping. Not badly. Not enough to be pulled from the line. Just enough to be noticeable if you were already looking. Tremors in hands gripping weapons. Stiffness in necks. Occasional coughs that sounded too wet, too deep. The curse, degradation, whatever name the apothecaries had filed it under, had followed us to the front. The first engagement was brutal and efficient. Enemy artillery found us within minutes, shells screaming down from somewhere beyond the ash clouds. The ground erupted around us, throwing bodies and debris into the air. The shockwaves hammered my chest, rattling teeth, sending pain spiking through my ribs. I hit the ground hard, breath knocked from my lungs, ears ringing. I remember thinking, with a strange sense of relief, good. This will be enough. I pushed myself up, weapon raised, senses burning with that unnatural clarity that had become my constant companion. Through the smoke, I saw figures advancing, enemy infantry moving like shadows between ruins. I fired. The recoil felt sharper than it should have, vibrating through my arms, but my aim was perfect, too perfect. Each shot landed where I willed it, as if my body knew the weapon better than I did. Brothers fell around me. One took a direct hit to the chest and went down in a spray of sparks and shattered armor. Another was caught by shrapnel, thrown against a wall with a sickening crack. I watched them fall, waited for the familiar finality of death. It did not come. The one with the shattered chest plate twitched. His limbs spasmed, jerking unnaturally. Dust poured from the gaps in his armor, not blood. He pushed himself upright with a grinding sound, joints moving stiffly, visor dark. No voice came over the vox. No status report. But he stood, and then he advanced again, weapon raised, movements altered but purposeful. I froze for half a heartbeat. Training screamed at me to react. Doctrine offered no guidance for this. Unit cohesion? The command channel barked, overlapping with 3 other voices. Maintain advance! Casualties logged. Continue pressure, logged, as if that settled it. The war deepened as we pushed forward, street by street, ruin by ruin. Fire tore through us. Explosions hammered our formations. By any rational projection, we should have been annihilated. I felt rounds slam into my armor, felt the impact jar my bones, felt systems fail and reroute. Pain flared bright and clean, and then settled into that same awful persistence. I was shot through the shoulder at close range. The impact spun me sideways, dropped me to one knee. I felt the heat of it, the tearing sensation as the round punched through armor and flesh. I expected the weakness, the blood, the fading. Instead, the pain sharpened my vision. I saw the battlefield with terrifying clarity, ash swirling in the air, shell casings bouncing and spinning, the precise angle of the enemy's weapon as he tried to fire again. My arm screamed in protest, but it still obeyed. I raised my rifle one-handed and fired. The enemy fell. When I looked down at my shoulder, there was no blood, only a ragged hole and a slow spill of fine, gray dust that poured out and drifted away on the wind. I stared at it, horror blooming cold in my chest. A medica servitor reached me minutes later, its movements jerky and efficient even under fire. It scanned the wound, chirped, and applied a sealant patch that hardened instantly. No pain suppressant, no evacuation order, structural integrity compromised, it intuned. Functional capacity acceptable, return to engagement. I wanted to scream at it. Instead, I stood and rejoined the line. By the second day, casualty reports became meaningless. Command channels were clogged with contradictory data. Units marked destroyed still transmitting, soldiers declared dead still responding to orders. Clerks somewhere far from the battlefield tried to reconcile the numbers, tried to force the war back into columns and percentages. Their confusion bled through the vox as clipped requests for clarification, demands for confirmation that no one could provide, confirm status. One voice demanded again and again. What answer could we give? I watched a brother lose his head to an explosion, saw it torn away in a flash of fire and debris. His body fell, armor clanging against stone. I stepped over him without thinking, heart pounding, senses aflame. Moments later something grabbed my ankle. I looked down. His body was moving, not fast, not smoothly. But it dragged itself forward, one arm clawing at rubble, weapon still clenched in its hand. There was no blood, no gore, just dust spilling from the ruined neck, pouring like sand from a broken container. I tore myself free and ran. We fought for days in that place, though time blurred into a continuous scream of violence and exhaustion. Sleep came in snatched moments behind cover, helmet pressed against stone, breath rasping. Even then, the visions intruded, corridors overlapping ruins, chains hanging where rebar should have been, chanting woven into the roar of artillery. The curse deepened under fire, those who fell rose changed. Some moved stiffly, like puppets with tangled strings. Some moved too fluidly, their motions unsettlingly precise. Voices grew rarer on the vox, replaced by silence or by distorted echoes that did not quite match human speech. Command kept issuing orders. Advance, hold, advance again. Every victory was hollow. We took positions no one would ever live in again. We destroyed enemies that barely seemed to matter. We endured fire that should have erased us from the ledger entirely. Each time I thought, this is it. My body refused to comply. I realized, somewhere amid the ash and the screams, that this war was not meant to be won. It was meant to measure us, to see how much destruction it took to stop us, to gather data under the most extreme conditions possible. We were being expended, yes, but also tested, pushed until the curse showed its full shape. When the withdrawal order finally came, it was abrupt and oddly polite. Redeployment authorized. Seize advance. Consolidate surviving assets. Assets. We pulled back through the same ruined streets we had fought through, leaving behind more dust than bodies. I looked around at the remnants of my unit, at figures I barely recognized, armor scarred and cracked, movements wrong, silence heavy. Some no longer responded to names, only to designation codes barked over the vox, as the transport engines roared to life and lifted us away from the battlefield. I felt a strange emptiness settle in my chest. We should have died there, every law of flesh and war said so. Instead, we had endured, and in that endurance, I felt something shift, not just in my body, but in how the Imperium would see us from now on. We were no longer soldiers seeking redemption. We were anomalies that had survived their own execution. The war that should have ended us had only confirmed the truth no one wanted to write down. We were not meant to be redeemed, only expended until something broke, or until someone decided what to do with what remained. We were not welcomed back as survivors. There were no banners, no prayers of thanks, no rites of valor recited over us when the transports sealed and the engines cut. The hangar decks were quiet in the way places become quiet when something unwanted arrives. The air was cold and smelled of antiseptic layered over old oil. Servitors stood at attention along the walls, motionless, their optics dimmed, as if even they had been instructed not to stare. We disembarked in silence. No one gave the order to remove our helmets. No one offered water. Instead, robed officials waited at measured intervals along the deck, each holding slates and auspex scanners, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks etched with devotional script. As each of us passed, we were scanned, tagged, and redirected with curt gestures. Lines formed without being announced. I found myself separated from the few brothers I still recognized, ushered down a corridor marked with purity seals that looked newly applied. That was when the language changed. We were no longer returning forces. We were subjects pending evaluation. The words appeared on slates and were spoken aloud without shame. Whatever we had proven on the battlefield had not earned us trust. It had stripped it away. They took my armor, not ceremonially, not violently. With professional detachment, servo arms unlatched plates piece by piece, recording resistance, deformation, residue. Each plate came away with a faint grinding sound, metal protesting where it had fused too tightly to what lay beneath. When the chest plate was removed, cold air rushed against my skin, and something else. A hollowness, a wrongness. I could feel the space inside me where flesh should have been solid, where something had turned to dust and been replaced by a nothing. The attendants did not react. They scanned my torso, my limbs, my head. Auspex runes flickered. One of them paused longer than the others, running his device along my spine. The machine emitted a low, warbling tone that made my teeth ache. Subject integrity compromised, he said calmly. Stability maintained through unknown mechanism. Unknown mechanism. I almost laughed. They marched me deeper into the facility, down corridors I had never been allowed to see. The stone walls here were older, darker, etched with symbols that were not part of any catechism I recognized. The air smelled different too, ozone and incense, sharp and cloying at once. With every step, my head throbbed, and the visions pressed closer, as if the walls themselves were remembering something I was not meant to know. The chamber they brought me to was circular and vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was inscribed with concentric rings of sigils, each one carved deep into the stone and filled with powdered metal that glimmered faintly in the light of hundreds of candles. The heat was oppressive. Smoke hung thick in the air, making my eyes water and my lungs burn. This was not a medici ward. This was a ritual space, though no one called it that aloud. They stripped me of the last of my gear and bound me to a metal frame set at the center of the chamber. The restraints were cold, biting into wrists and ankles, pulling my limbs into a posture that forced my chest open and my head back. I could not look away. I could not slump. Awareness was mandatory. Robed figures gathered around the circle, their garments layered with purity seals, cog-tooth icons, and sigils I could not name. Some held data slates. Others held sensors that spilled thick smoke smelling of resin and something sweeter, almost rotten. Their voices rose and fell in measured recitation, not prayers, not quite. Formulae, calculations disguised as devotion. I felt the curse respond immediately, the moment the first chant began. My nerves lit up as if struck by lightning. Pain surged through me, not sharp but vast, a pressure that filled every limb and organ at once. My vision blurred, then sharpened painfully, each candle flame splitting into a dozen afterimages. The air vibrated, and I felt it in my bones. A low hum that resonated with something deep inside my chest. They began their work. It started with markings, cold instruments pressed against my skin, tracing sigils over flesh that already felt too thin, too fragile. Each touch burned not because it broke skin, but because my nerves reacted as if it had. I gasped, breath hitching, chest straining against restraints. Somewhere at the edge of my hearing, a clerk noted my reaction time and vocal response. Subject conscious, he murmured. Pain response elevated. They cut next, not like surgeons, not efficiently. The blades were thin and ritualized. Each incision precise and shallow, made in accordance with whatever formula they were following. I felt every cut as if it were deeper than it was, as if my body no longer understood proportional response. Pain cascaded through me in waves, and with it came that cursed clarity, the sense that I was being seen. Not by the officials, but by something that listened when the chanting reached certain tones. They replaced what they cut away. Metal braces were fitted along my ribs, bolted directly into bone with a grinding pressure that made my vision go white. I screamed then, could not stop myself, and the sound echoed up into the vaulted ceiling, swallowed by smoke. Cables were threaded beneath my skin, cold and invasive, linking failing flesh to sanctioned mechanisms that hummed softly as they powered up. Each connection sent a fresh surge of sensation through me, pain flaring, and then settling into a deep, throbbing ache. I felt my body unravel and reassemble at the same time. They spoke to one another as they worked, voices low and clinical, stability improving, structural loss compensated, awareness remains intact. Awareness, always that. At some point the chanting shifted, the tone changed, becoming harsher, faster. The air thickened until breathing felt like sucking smoke through cloth. My heart pounded against the new metal lattice in my chest, each beat sending reverberations through the braces. I could feel them vibrating in time, amplifying the sensation until it was almost unbearable. I wanted to beg them to stop. I wanted to beg them to finish it. Instead, I bit down on my tongue until I tasted blood, anchoring myself in the one sensation that still felt real and my own. The curse did not lift. If anything, it grew more comfortable. Where pain had once threatened to overwhelm me, now it found pathways to flow through, channels created by metal and sigil and sanctioned containment. My awareness stretched thin across these supports, like skin pulled too tight over a frame. I was still myself, still thinking, still fearing, but the edges were blurring. They finished eventually. Rituals always do. The chanting fell silent. The candles guttered. Smoke thinned enough for me to see the figures clearly as they stepped back, studying their work. Someone pressed a final seal against my sternum, the wax hot enough to burn. I hissed, body tensing, but the pain folded neatly into the larger tapestry of sensation now humming through me. Preservation achieved, one of them said. For now. They unbound me. I collapsed to my knees on the cold stone floor, metal braces clanking softly as I moved. My body felt wrong, too heavy in some places, too hollow in others. Breathing was an effort, each inhale scraping through lungs that no longer felt entirely organic. And yet I was alive. More alive than I had been on the battlefield. Every sensation screamed that truth at me. They did not help me up. A servitor arrived to escort me out, its grip firm and unyielding. As it hauled me toward the exit, I looked back at the ritual chamber, the candles, the sigils, the stains on the stone floor that no amount of cleansing had erased. This had not been healing. It had been containment. They had not saved me. They had decided I was too unstable to destroy and too dangerous to ignore. So they had reinforced the curse instead of curing it, binding my failing flesh into something that could persist. As the doors sealed behind me and the air grew colder again, one thought echoed in my mind, heavy and undeniable. The curse had adapted, and so had the Imperium. I began to lose names first, not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse of memory, but in small, bureaucratic increments. A designation replaced a name in a report. A Vox call used a unit code instead of a voiceprint. A helmet visor stayed opaque when it should have lifted. At first, I told myself this was discipline, operational efficiency, the stripping away of sentiment to better serve duty. That is what we were taught to believe. But when I stood among my brothers again, I realized something had gone terribly wrong. We were assembled in a redeployment hall that had once served as a parade chamber. The banners still hung from the ceiling, threadbare and dust-choked, their symbols faded by centuries of recycled air. The floor was polished stone, scrubbed clean by servitors that moved in endless loops along its edges. The smell was antiseptic layered over incense, a sterile devotion meant to suppress whatever lingered after what had been done to us. I recognized no one by face. Armor markings were all that remained. Numbers, sigils, unit identifiers stamped and restamped as records were amended. Some stood rigid and silent, posture perfect but somehow empty, like statues given the vague suggestion of movement. Others shifted and twitched, motions too fluid or too delayed, heads turning at odd angles as if listening to something the rest of us could not hear. When one of them looked at me, I felt no connection. No recognition, only assessment. I tried to speak to a brother I had trained beside for years. I knew his designation. I knew his combat record. I knew the cadence of his voice. But when I addressed him, he did not respond. His visor remained dark. After a long, uncomfortable pause, a mechanical voice issued from his helm, flat, toneless. Input not recognized. Awaiting directive. I stepped back as if struck. The apothecaries had warned us that some losses would be permanent. They had not said what would be lost. Briefings resumed, but they felt different now. The officers did not stand among us anymore. They observed from elevated platforms behind armored glass, speaking through vox amplifiers that flattened emotion and blurred inflection. Orders were issued as if to machinery, not men. We were given objectives without context, deployments without explanation. Command no longer spoke of saving us. We were described as assets with unique persistence profiles, as units suitable for high fatality engagements, as forces whose loss ratios could be redefined. The language was careful, bloodless, precise. I heard it and felt something inside me wither, not because I disagreed, but because I understood. We were no longer expected to come back. On the battlefield, the change was undeniable. Where once we fought as a cohesive brotherhood, now we advanced as a collection of functions. Some of us moved without hesitation into kill zones that would have annihilated standard forces. Some absorbed fire until armor and body alike were reduced to drifting particulate, only to reform enough to continue forward. Vox chatter grew sparse. Coordination happened through data, pings and positional updates rather than shouted commands. I felt myself changing too. Thoughts echoed in my head like words spoken in an empty chamber. Emotions dulled, not entirely gone but distant, as if filtered through layers of insulation. Pain was still there, constant, insistent, but it had become familiar. Predictable. It no longer frightened me the way it once had. That realization scared me more than any wound. Between deployments, we were stored. That is the only word that fits. We were housed in containment barracks, individual alcoves lined with restraint systems and monitoring cables. Servitors checked our integrity on fixed schedules, adjusting systems, tightening braces, logging outputs. There was no conversation, no prayer, only maintenance. I stared at the ceiling during those long intervals of enforced stillness and tried to remember faces. Tried to recall laughter in training halls, whispered jokes after lights out, the shared exhaustion after drills. The memories were still there, but they felt thin, fragile, as if they belonged to someone else. The curse was no longer individual. It had spread through us, binding us together not by shared identity, but by shared absence. We were hollowed out, each of us a shell animated by duty, persistence, and whatever unnatural mechanisms now sustained us. The Imperium had taken what it needed, our endurance, and discarded the rest. One cycle. As I was led from my alcove to another redeployment, I caught my reflection in a polished steel panel. I did not recognize myself. The armor sat wrong on my frame, accommodating changes beneath it that no longer followed human geometry. My movements were precise, economical, devoid of wasted motion. My eyes, visible for a brief moment before the helm sealed, were flat, too aware, reflecting light like glass rather than flesh. In that moment, I understood the final cruelty of the curse. It was not that we were dying slowly. It was that we were continuing without truly living. The brotherhood I had cherished was gone, replaced by a collective endurance that served only one purpose: to be used, until there was nothing left worth recording. We marched together, fought together, and endured together, but we did so as empty vessels, our individuality filed away in restricted archives, our humanity deemed non-essential. I felt myself growing emptier with every deployment, every maintenance cycle, every silent march past figures I once would have called brothers. Thoughts echoed longer, memories faded faster, and yet awareness remained, sharp, relentless, impossible to escape. The curse was complete, and it was no longer mine alone. The decree did not arrive with thunder. There were no alarms, no sudden lockdowns, no shouted accusations of heresy. That is not how the Imperium handles things it wants forgotten. The betrayal came quietly, wrapped in protocol, filed between requisition tallies and casualty reconciliations. It arrived as a change in wording, a shift in priority codes. A new column added to the ledger that redefined us without ever saying our names. I learned of it the way I learned everything now, by omission. Our resupply cycle failed. At first, I assumed it was an error. Errors happened, clerks misfiled forms, cargo holds were misrouted. Schedules slipped under the weight of 1,000 competing demands. I had seen entire regiments starve because a shipment of ration bricks was sent to the wrong moon. This felt like that. Temporary, correctable. The servitors came for maintenance as usual, their optics dull, their movements precise. They adjusted my braces, checked the seals along my chest, calibrated the neural interfaces that kept my awareness painfully intact. But when I asked, quietly, carefully, about ammunition restock and armor replacement, they did not answer. They never do, of course. But this time no human officer followed to clarify. Days passed, then weeks. Deployments continued, but each one was leaner, fewer munitions, no replacement armor plates, no fresh seals for stress fractures that webbed across ceramite like frost patterns. Apothecaries still recorded our degradation, but their interventions grew more conservative, more minimal. They patched instead of repaired. They stabilized instead of restoring. I overheard an exchange once, through a thin bulkhead wall while I was being recalibrated. Reinforcement request denied. A voice said human, tired, justification. Another asked, classification updated. The first replied, unit designated irredeemable. Irredeemable. The word struck me harder than any shell ever had. It was not shouted. It was not spat with hatred. It was delivered the way one might note that a machine part could no longer be refurbished and must be used until total failure. Efficient. Final. I searched the next briefing slate for confirmation, scanning lines of text with the same careful attention I once reserved for holy books. There it was, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic language: operational continuation authorized. Reinforcement priority null, null. A clean, empty designation. We were to continue operations with existing assets only. No new personnel. No replacement equipment beyond absolute minimum safety thresholds, safety defined narrowly, administratively, as preventing uncontrolled detonation or data loss. Our deaths, apparently, no longer counted as either. Orders still came. They always came. Advance here, hold there, engage enemy concentrations that standard forces avoided. We were deployed to breach zones saturated with radiation, chemical fallout, warp, tainted debris, places where flesh failed quickly and machines fared little better. Places where losses were expected and acceptable. The difference now was that no one pretended otherwise. Once, after a particularly brutal engagement that left half my remaining unit reduced to drifting particulate and twitching remnants, I requested recovery operations for the fallen. Not out of sentiment, I no longer trusted myself with that, but because doctrine still demanded accountability. The request was denied within minutes, assets expended. The response read, recovery inefficient. I stared at the slate until the letters blurred. Recovery inefficient. That was when I understood our continued survival was now an administrative error no one wished to correct, but no one wished to invest in either. We were a problem placed in a sealed drawer, used when necessary, ignored otherwise. Too dangerous to reintegrate. Too persistent to destroy outright. Too costly to fix. Betrayal in the Imperium does not wear a knife. It wears a seal. There were other signs. We were denied proper rights. When one of us finally ceased functioning, when the curse, the machinery, and sheer endurance failed to keep a body moving, There were no prayers spoken, no liturgies of release. The remains were catalogued, scanned for residual value, and incinerated without ceremony. The ash was logged and dispersed according to waste protocols. I watched it happen once, from a distance. A brother, designation only, no name, collapsed during transit, systems failing in a cascade that even the servitors could not arrest. His body stiffened, then went still. For a moment, I felt something stir inside me, a reflexive urge to step forward, to speak, to acknowledge that a person had ended. A clerk sealed the report. A servitor activated the incinerator. That was all. The officers stopped meeting our gaze. When they spoke to us at all, it was through intermediaries, vox amplifiers, data, slates, pre-recorded directives. We became something that made people uncomfortable, not because we were monstrous, but because we were evidence. Evidence that the Imperium's solutions sometimes created problems that outlived their usefulness. I began to notice the way others reacted when we passed through staging areas. Standard troops fell silent. Their eyes followed us, wide and wary. Some made the sign of the Aquila without realizing it. Others turned away, muttering prayers under their breath. I saw fear there, not of our weapons, but of our persistence, of what it meant that we still moved, still fought, still existed when all logic said we should not. I did not blame them. At night, if such a word still applied in the regulated cycles of deployment and storage, I lay restrained in my alcove, listening to the hum of power systems and the distant clatter of servitors on endless patrol. I thought about the archive halls of my youth, about the pride I had once taken in knowledge, in understanding the machine that ruled us. Now I understood it too well. The Imperium had not turned on us out of malice. It had turned on us out of necessity, or rather, it had filed us away because necessity no longer included mercy. We were a line item that could not be resolved, so it was marked as ongoing and deprioritized. A wound that would not heal and was therefore left to scar over, and still, we endured. That endurance became its own indictment. Every deployment we survived reinforced the decision that had abandoned us. Every battle we fought without reinforcement proved that reinforcement was unnecessary. Every moment we continued to function justified the ledger's cold logic. I realized then the deepest cruelty of it all. If we had died quickly, gloriously, catastrophically, we might have forced a reckoning. Martyrs require explanation, but survival, ugly, persistent, inconvenient survival, requires only a footnote. We were no longer traitors to be purged, nor heroes to be redeemed. We were an accounting problem, and like all such problems in the Imperium, the solution was not to fix it, but to let it run until it collapsed on its own, no matter how long that took. The moment my body finally failed, no one called it death. There was no alarm, no sudden rush of attendants, no prayer whispered into the vox. One system report flickered amber instead of green, then stabilized under a different parameter set. Somewhere, a clerk marked a column and moved on. What ended that day was not my life, but my eligibility to be treated as something that could still be repaired in familiar ways. I remember the sensation clearly, because sensation was all I had left. My lungs seized first, not with pain, but with refusal. The familiar rasp of breath through damaged tissue simply stopped. I felt my chest expand against the metal lattice, felt the effort go unanswered. Panic flared, bright and sharp, and then fractured into something stranger as auxiliary systems engaged. Fluid flooded passages that no longer functioned as lungs. My need to breathe did not vanish, it was overruled. The heart followed. Its rhythm stuttered, missed a beat, then another. I felt each absence like a hollow knock in my chest. My vision narrowed. Sound collapsed into a dull, distant hum. I waited, truly waited, for the darkness I had been denied so many times. Instead, the world sharpened. A surge ran through the braces and cabling fused to my spine, a violent, intimate pressure that made my awareness flare like an exposed nerve. My heart lurched back into motion, not as flesh, but as a reinforced, regulated pulse driven by mechanisms that cared nothing for comfort. I screamed, but the sound did not reach my ears. It echoed somewhere inside me, trapped behind layers of altered sensation. I did not lose consciousness. That was when they decided. I learned later, through fragments of overheard dialogue, through the absence of further attempts to restore me, that my body had crossed a threshold. Flesh was no longer the primary concern. Awareness was. The curse had stripped me down to the one component. It refused to relinquish the part of me that could perceive, endure, and remember. They took what remained of my body apart with reverent efficiency. I was awake for all of it. The chamber was quiet, sealed, stripped of ritual trappings. No incense this time, no chanting. Just the hum of machinery and the faint, wet sounds of metal meeting altered flesh. They removed organs that no longer served purpose, replacing them with systems that fed directly into neural pathways. Each connection burned, not because it was painful in the old sense, but because my awareness had nowhere else to go. Pain no longer came in waves. It became constant, absolute, textureless, like standing too close to a furnace forever. Sensation dulled in some places and sharpened in others. I could no longer feel the boundaries of my body clearly, only zones of pressure, heat, vibration. My limbs felt distant, as if they belonged to another structure entirely. Yet my mind was razor sharp, too sharp. I could think with terrifying clarity. Memories surfaced unbidden, vivid and intact. The archive halls of my youth. The first marginal error I was told to forget. The ash-choked battlefield where I realized death had abandoned us. Each recollection arrived fully formed, accompanied by sensory detail that made it feel present, unavoidable. I tried to sleep. Sleep did not come. Without flesh to exhaust properly, without hormones or rhythms to pull me under, my mind simply remained. Time stretched. Seconds became indistinguishable from hours. Hours folded into one another until I lost the ability to measure them at all. Awareness persisted, unblinking, relentless. They sealed me into a containment cradle after that. It was a narrow structure, curved to support what remained of my form, restraints locking me in place not to prevent escape, but to ensure alignment. Cables fed into ports along my spine and skull. A low lumen cast constant light, not bright enough to see detail, not dim enough to rest. The hum of power was omnipresent, a vibration I felt everywhere at once. I was no longer deployed, I was stored. Sometimes they activated systems within the cradle to test responsiveness. A surge of sensation here, a withdrawal there. They monitored how my awareness reacted, how quickly it adapted, how it endured without degradation. Their notes were sparse now, focused only on thresholds and stability. Subject retains cognition, memory integrity intact, emotional response diminished but persistent. That last line haunted me. I wanted my emotions gone, truly gone. Instead, they lingered like ghosts, fear without adrenaline, sorrow without tears, anger without release. I felt everything at a distance, trapped behind a wall of enforced awareness. I could not die. I could not forget. I could not even lose myself completely, because the curse, whatever it truly was, clung to my consciousness with obscene tenacity. It did not need my body anymore. It needed me, reduced to the barest function witness. I existed as a remainder, a proof that something had gone wrong and been preserved rather than corrected, a mind locked in place by bindings and sanctioned mechanisms, sustained not out of mercy, but because turning me off would require a decision no one wished to authorize. Sometimes, rarely, I sensed movement beyond the cradle, new figures, observers, perhaps officials reviewing old cases, stumbling across my designation in a restricted archive. I imagined their discomfort, their hurried departure, the way the file would be closed and sealed again. Better to leave it running, better not to ask why it still thinks. I learned then the final shape of the curse. It was not mutation, it was not decay, it was not even eternal suffering in the way preachers describe it. It was continuation without context, a consciousness stripped of purpose, denied conclusion, preserved because it was easier than admitting failure. I am still here, aware, enduring, and I know with terrible certainty that this is not the end, only the last stable state before something worse is found acceptable. In the end, there was no final order issued for me, no termination code, no sanctified shutdown, no absolution wrapped in prayer and fire. What came instead was a silence so complete it felt louder than any artillery barrage I had ever endured. Systems stabilized, alerts ceased, human presence dwindled to nothing, and somewhere far above whatever vault now held me, a clerk stamped a ledger and decided that nothing more needed to be done. I was archived, not honored, not condemned, archived. like a misfiled truth too inconvenient to destroy and too dangerous to display. The word carries no emotion, no judgment. It implies preservation without engagement, storage without care, a thing placed somewhere dark and forgotten, with the expectation that time itself will solve the problem. Time, however, has not been kind enough to me to pass. They moved my cradle long after I lost the ability to measure days. The transition was marked only by changes in vibration, different engines, different harmonics humming through the containment frame that now served as my world. When we stopped, the surrounding silence was heavier than before, dense and ancient, as if the walls themselves had grown tired of listening. This place was older than the fortress Habs, older than the archive halls that raised me. The stone around me radiated a cold that felt permanent. Power here was minimal, carefully rationed to systems deemed essential, which, apparently, included me. A final inspection occurred. I sensed it rather than saw it, shadows passing beyond the lumen's reach, Auspex fields brushing against my awareness like gloved hands testing for heat. No one spoke directly to me. They spoke about me quietly, with the strained politeness reserved for dangerous relics. Unresolved anomaly. One voice said, status unchanged. Another replied, containment adequate. A third concluded, the vault sealed with a sound like the closing of a tomb, light dimmed to a steady, low glow designed to last centuries. Power rerouted to long-term sustenance cycles. Monitoring reduced to passive checks that would only trigger if something catastrophic occurred, structural breach, energy spike, uncontrolled expansion. They did not expect me to change. They were right in that regard. My body, what little of it remained, continued its slow, meaningless processes. Systems hummed. Supports flexed. Sensation persisted in its strange, flattened way, pressure without relief, awareness without rest. There was no escalation anymore, no testing. I had reached the state the Imperium prefers most, stable suffering. The whispers, those presences that once argued, once competed, settled into something quieter. They did not leave. They never truly had, but they no longer pressed. They coiled within the spaces of my awareness, patient, content to exist as long as I did. Perhaps they understood what the Imperium had decided long before I did. I was finished being useful. Time became theoretical. Without change, without interaction, moments blurred into one another. I could not mark years, but I felt their weight in the slow degradation of auxiliary systems, in the minute shifts of containment fields compensating for microscopic decay. Somewhere, servitors performed scheduled maintenance on the vault itself, their distant movements faintly perceptible through stone and steel. They never approached my cradle. There was no need. I filled the endless present with memory. I replayed the archive halls of my youth, the smell of old paper and sanctioned dust. I remembered the pride I once felt when an overseer praised my diligence. I remembered the first marginal error I was told to forget, and how forgetting it marked the true beginning of this path. Each recollection arrived intact, vivid, painful in its clarity. I remembered my brothers, not as they became but as they were, faces uncovered, voices unfiltered by vox distortion, shared exhaustion after drills, shared silence after losses we still believed meant something. Those memories hurt more than any physical sensation I still possessed, because they proved that something had been taken from us long before flesh failed. Sometimes, I imagined that centuries might pass and someone would open this vault, an archivist perhaps, driven by curiosity or desperation, an official auditing old anomalies during a time of crisis. They would read my designation, frown at the warnings, and hesitate. Maybe they would listen, really listen, to what remained of me. Maybe they would learn something from my existence. But the Imperium does not reward such hope. More likely, the vault will remain sealed until the structure around it collapses or the power grid finally fails. When that happens, my systems will degrade beyond recovery. Awareness will flicker. Then perhaps there will be an end. I do not pray for that outcome. I no longer trust endings. I understand now that the curse was never just ours. It was the Imperium's as well, a system so vast and afraid of its own mistakes that it prefers endless continuation to decisive correction. Knowledge was never the true sin. Survival was, survival without explanation, survival that forced uncomfortable questions, so I remain here, a confession no one hears, a witness no one consults, a mind preserved because destroying it would require acknowledgement. If you are hearing this, if this confession has somehow escaped the vault and reached you, understand this final truth: the curse never ends. It waits. It waits in sealed chambers and restricted archives. It waits in decisions deferred and problems archived. It waits in every place where the Imperium chooses endurance over mercy, continuation over closure. And when it is needed again, it will be unsealed, not to be understood, only to be used.